And joining us today for the pundits, we have Bill Spence of the Lewiston Tribune, Dr. Stephanie Witt of Boise State University, Clark Corbin of Idaho Education News, and Betsy Russell of the Idaho Press. Bill, I wanted to start with you. We just heard from Senator Vick that not funding Medicaid expansion is still on the table. Is that a surprise to you?
It is, actually. I had heard that from a couple of people, but checking with others, they kind of discounted that, and this was from people that I would trust. But I also got to point out that the governor was one of the people that told me that when he counts the votes, he thought it would be close. But I am surprised that there is still a willingness to even consider that, given the size of the vote to pass it.
Right, 61% of Idaho voters in November weighed in on this. Stephanie, I wanted to get your take.
Well, it is true that a large majority of voters wanted this, but that doesn't obligate the legislature to do anything. This is the Medicaid expansion is a statute like any other statute, and if the legislature chooses to get rid of it or change it or make amendments to it, that's their prerogative. I'm not saying it's a smart one or that it bodes well for how we think about representative government going, but we've seen them in years past do this with term limits. So even though large majorities of Idahoans voted for term limits, they just said, nope, we're not doing it. I don't see that happening here because of the signals we did get from the governor that he will abide by the will of the people.
And though we heard that it's not likely, it's still on the table, let's go down that path. What are the possibilities if the legislature doesn't fund Medicaid?
Well, right now, Medicaid expansion is the law in Idaho, and the legislature doesn't have to do anything to keep it as the law. It is the law. All they have to do is fund it, and the governor has given them an extremely easy way out. His budget for next year says they don't even need to spend $1 of general fund money on this. You can do it all with Millennium Fund and savings. There's really not that much to decide in that case, and so there's not that much to rebel against.
Yeah, but the funding issue is the critical issue, is if the legislature exercises its financial authority and does not appropriate funding for it, I'm not sure, other than the governor stepping in, I'm not sure there's a way to force the legislature. If people sued the legislature, for example, I don't know that they'd have a leg to stand on, because the legislature has the authority to appropriate or not appropriate money.
But you mentioned the governor, and the governor has a couple avenues open to him to compel the legislature to fund Medicaid expansion, especially after campaigning and saying that he's going to respect the will of the voters, and the will of the voters was expanding Medicaid.
Well, it is an immensely popular idea, and we saw large crowds this morning at the legislative hearing to discuss this, and continue to see the press from ordinary people who are saying this is something we really need and want. But you know, it doesn't get any easier than the governor made it, like you said. You know, you don't even have to find any money this year, really, and next year, you know, it makes room in the budget if you want to look at the grocery tax repeal or whatever. I mean, he had this plan in his budget that makes it easy to do. But this is a legislative body that refused to expand Medicaid or look at it for year after year after year after the passage of the Affordable Care Act. So I think, you know, they're not in a mood to suddenly embrace it. And I don't think it helps as well that we still don't know exactly how much money we're going to have this year, that the the revenues coming in are not up to what we expected due to the change in the tax law, and it adds an extra layer of uncertainty.
On the other hand, we have a new governor. And while Governor Otter convened several task forces that studied the issue and came up with recommendations saying, yes, the state should expand Medicaid, he did not push that through the legislature. He always waited for the legislature to act, and they chose not to. This governor has not taken that approach. He campaigned on this issue. He pledged to support the will of the voters, and it would be actually very interesting to see how he exercises that leadership. The governor does have power in this area. He can veto bills. He can hold bills hostage. His relationship with the legislature thus far has been a very cordial one. We have not seen that kind of combat. And so we'll find out how Brad Little works these things out.
But we've also only been in session for 5 weeks, and we haven't seen a veto yet. although there haven't been many bills passing
much
through in the first place. You know, he also has the power to call a special session if it comes down to that, right?
That's true, but in some ways that would be kind of beside the point, because we're talking about timing that's happening right now. The Department of Health and Welfare has to submit their plan amendment by February 18th. They will do so. The timeline calls for this not to start until next January 1, but for the pieces to get, the wheels to start turning to get it in place. And a long delay in that and a special session just kind of sounds like a waste of time and money.
And admittedly, that is not a very likely scenario. But what is more likely is the idea of sideboards. That's something that we've heard from multiple people, and what you heard this week, Dr. Witt.
Yes, I was at a panel where legislative leadership were talking to county officials from all over the state, and it seemed to me that the speaker was very interested in establishing what he called sort of a responsibility check on the people that we're going to give the new insurance to. That I assume he means things like work requirements or some kind of testing, drug testing perhaps, I don't know exactly, but a thing to keep in mind is, we've said before, those are not covered by that 90-10 federal match. So any sideboards we put on to Medicaid expansion are going to have to come out of Idaho's budget. And while we may have some of those things ready, you're going to have to find the money for that.
Now, we were talking before the show about the idea of how much sideboards might cost, and you had a good point about the infrastructure that's already in place in Idaho.
I've talked with a group of House conservatives who have kind of a whole menu of waiver requests that they've been talking about, 10 or 11, which includes the things that you've talked about, you know, potentially drug testing, co-payments of various natures, lifetime limits for how long you can be on Medicaid, and work requirements. And talking with them about the work requirements, there's been reports in the news that look, this is something that would cost the state millions of dollars and unnecessary expenditures. And the response that I got was those estimates are coming from states that did not have any kind of infrastructure in place to gather the information about Medicaid enrollees. The explanation to me, which I have not checked, but is that Idaho already has work requirements in some of its other welfare programs. So adding this new requirement for Medicaid would not be require a major investment of funding, that it's just kind of adding on to what we're already doing.
So how does that work if there's a lifetime limit on Medicaid coverage? And we're thinking that the expansion of Medicaid is going to get rid of the CAT fund, right, and the indigent health care that counties will have to provide over time. But if at some point people exit out the other end of Medicaid expansion and are still indigent, then they're going to show up back at the counties, and we're going to have another burden on counties trying to pay health care.
I think the governor and a number of House members have been very clear that, look, what we really want is off-ramps, systems in place so that we can help people transition from Medicaid, from welfare systems to self-sufficiency, and have protections in place so that they don't fall through the cracks. There have, to my knowledge, there hasn't been a lot of detail on what those off-ramps look like, but I think that's their response to that is we're not kind of kicking people out the back door and trying to forget about them. We want to have other systems in place that will continue to help.
So I have even heard some talk about the idea of instituting a voluntary training or job training program to go with Medicaid expansion. Yeah. And the advantage of that is it would not require a waiver from the federal government. It would be something that Idaho could simply do, of course, entirely at its own expense, but apparently some other states have had good experiences with that. So maybe something like that could emerge as a potential off-ramp.
5 weeks into the legislative session, we still haven't seen a bill addressing sideboards or the CAT fund. There's still a lot of uncertainty involving that. Are you surprised that such a critical issue that the legislature has been talking about even before Proposition 2 passed, we haven't seen legislation on it yet?
I think that these particular, and it's a good point that we haven't seen them now, because there is a deadline coming up for bill introductions in non-privileged committees, and we've seen a flurry of bill introductions this week because of that. But I think that these kinds of very intense, prickly political issues tend to be hashed out in back rooms and popped out late in the session in an attempt to, ram through a done deal.
And specifically on the waivers, part of the response to that is, look, we wanted to wait until we got a ruling from the Supreme Court on the lawsuit before even trying to move forward with this. So.
And I'd be remiss not to touch on the ruling from the Supreme Court, but first I wanted to bring Clark in on the conversation. A big sticking point for some lawmakers, at least in public, before Proposition 2 passed, was they were concerned that expanding Medicaid would take money away from public schools. Is that something that you're hearing now on the education side, that voters have endorsed Medicaid expansion?
I think you're right that we heard a little bit about that maybe during the campaign season as campaign rhetoric. As Betsy pointed out at the top of the segment today, the governor has made that sort of a non-issue. He laid out an education budget that implemented the 5th year of teacher raises, which is the big thing driving education spending this year, and he kept Medicaid expansion away from the general fund in the upcoming fiscal year. And so I don't think that that's a decision point that the legislators are having to wrestle with based on the governor's recommendations at this point.
And this week, of course, we had the Idaho Supreme Court rule that Medicaid expansion is, in fact, constitutional. Betsy, what were your takeaways from that opinion?
The court was very clear. It could not have been more clear. The opinion by Chief Justice Roger Burdick said repeatedly that the arguments that the Freedom Foundation laid out, that this initiative was unconstitutional, were without merit. And every now and then, instead of without merit, he said unpersuasive. Pretty much it was just right down the line. No, this is not unconstitutional. This is basically how government works, as far as state and federal governments collaborating, working together on programs that touch both. 2 of the 5 justices wanted to throw the case out just on procedural grounds and not even get to the merits. I found it interesting that the Freedom Foundation, I have as yet seen no public statements from them about this decision. They were very out there before the decision, saying this was going to create zombie legislators and it's so unconstitutional. They've had no response, but their attorney did speak with me when the decision came down, and he said that he took some solace in the fact that the justices said, no, this doesn't mean that we automatically accept future federal laws that the federal government might pass, and that's good to know. They've affirmed that, and he felt that their having brought the lawsuit made sure that wouldn't happen.
It's something we will continue to keep an eye on, as the Freedom Foundation is now trying to persuade lawmakers to overturn Medicaid expansion in a column released today. I wanted to turn the conversation to the public schools funding formula. Again, this is something that lawmakers have been talking about for a long time, but we have yet to see an actual bill introduced. In fact, it seems like up until this week, they're still making some major changes.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Just over a week ago, some legislators introduced a draft bill online that's designed to overhaul Idaho's 25-year-old public school funding formula. In simple terms, what they're talking about doing is replacing the old attendance-based method of school funding with an enrollment-based method of funding, whereby the money would follow the student. That part of the proposition, that part of the proposal has a lot of support, a lot of buy-in. It actually originated in Governor Butch Otter's Task Force for Education Reform recommendations in 2013. But beyond that, when we get into some of the funding weights and some of the different scenarios and implications, that's where it gets a little bit more complicated, and that's where some of the concern and skepticism is coming in with some of these funding incentives and funding weights and some of the details about how that would be implemented.
So they've been working on this for 3 years now. Does it surprise you that there have been some pretty sizable changes this week, halfway through the legislative session?
I think it's still very much a work in progress, and I think even the folks drafting the bill would say that it's a work in progress. Yes, there was an interim committee that worked on this for 3 years, but you got to keep in mind, this could not be a bigger issue. It's going to affect every Idahoan, whether you're a parent, a grandparent, a student, an educator, or a taxpayer. Education spending, as your viewers know, is the largest general fund expense every year in the state of Idaho. Almost 50% of all general fund spending at this time goes to K-12 public education. And so that's why this proposal is being scrutinized so heavily because of the amount of money involved and because of the people that it affects. And I think that some of the changes that you mentioned, particularly some of these spreadsheets that we've seen that are designed to illustrate the effects of a change in the funding formula, those have changed from week to week and month to month. And I think that's one of the things that's kind of confused some of the educators out in the community, pardon me. And there have been some new things even this week. There's now in the spreadsheets a proposal to reimburse school districts based on the experience of their teaching force. That's brand new this week, and I don't think that's in the draft bill yet, but that's in the latest spreadsheet. There's also competing plans about how do we treat school districts during the transition. Do we infuse extra state funding to hold them harmless so they don't experience a loss in funding? Or what about if we put even more money in to hold them positive so everybody got a 2% increase? And it's some of those details that are very much in flux. What do we do with teacher salaries? That's another big issue for people that, to my knowledge, hasn't been resolved at this point, Melissa.
I actually think it's not surprising that we're still seeing changes because of the way this works. Basically, the new funding formula is a new framework for deciding how we divide up the money between the districts. And the framework has all these different inputs that then change the outcome. And it is set up, I mean, as an Excel spreadsheet, but really in a way where you can change this input and look at that output and change this other input. And that's the process that they've started now. And the interim committee, after 3 years of work, brought this to the House and Senate Education Committees and said, okay, we now hand it off to you. You decide which inputs you want based on what outcomes you want, and now's the time to make the decision. And so the House and Senate Education Committees are turning to all the stakeholders and saying, what do you think? And the stakeholders are saying, number one, we should have been involved earlier, but number two, we don't like this one, we don't like that one. What about if you change this one? And those changes are being made and can be made.
So arguably they're being responsive to the stakeholders' concerns at this point,
Yes.
instead of being indecisive.
Yeah, and I think they've been very clear about that yes, the formula has changed, and that's specifically in reaction to the feedback that we've been getting. So don't criticize us for making changes that you're asking for.
You know, there's a question that I had about the data that is being used to develop this and figure this out. You know, in my experience, sometimes the state's data is incomplete.
Yeah.
Has that come up in the conversation?
It's something that's come up in the conversation, and it's something that at Idaho Education News that we've run into from time to time. But even during the interim committee phase, there was a consultant from a group called Education Commission of the States. His name was Michael Griffiths. And he talked about some of the data that would be, massive amounts of data that would be needed to be built into this funding formula in order to drive the money to the different school districts. And he talked specifically about how certain data sets right now that aren't necessarily tied closely to funding, that data is, let's charitably say, less valid than some of the data that does drive funding. And so that's been out on the record throughout the interim committee process. We had a meeting with lawmakers earlier this week, talked a little bit about that, but there are, I would say, some instances where some data sets are less valid, less reliable, less complete than other data sets.
But it's not like lawmakers are using bad data instead of good data. The good data just might not exist in this case, from what I'm hearing.
Yeah, it's not a conscious decision to take the bad data, and I think some people aren't even aware that this could be a factor here. And so no, I don't think it's anything devious that they're doing on purpose. I think a lot of people may not even realize that it could be a concern. But when I think safe and drug-free funding money is one of the things that they talked about. If that's not directly tied to certain reports, then maybe that isn't all there. We've also talked about how do we define at-risk students, right? That's one of the big funding weights where that would be included in the new funding formula. Do we use census data? Do we use poverty data? Do we use free and reduced lunch ratios from school districts? And so we don't exactly know how we would define all of the things that would go into the new funding formula. Also enrollment. How do we define full-time enrollment versus fractional enrollment? What does student mobility look like? How many payments do we send to school districts each year? A lot of those types of details are yet to be resolved and would need to be resolved in order to pass something like this into law.
So what I'm hearing is, based on the uncertainty surrounding at least some of those data points and definitions, we're not going to know who the winners and losers might be until this has already been in place for a while.
That was one of the things that came up during that massive public hearing on Thursday, and folks from several different school districts were actually saying, could we get the most current data, compare apples to apples. So if we're talking about 17-18 enrollment numbers, let's talk about 17-18 funding levels, but then can we project out not just 1 year, but maybe 3 years out or 5 years out? And then what happens if we take away the hold harmless provisions? And so I think some people are really looking to build it up with apples to apples comparison, the most recently available data, and then project out 3 to 5 years so we have an idea, where would some of these small school districts stand? What about these growing school districts? How would they be affected down the road?
All right, from one contentious topic to another, redistricting was in the legislature this past week. Bill, you were in that hearing. Can you run us through what exactly the proposal does and why it's so controversial?
Sure. So it's a proposed constitutional amendment, which would, even if it makes it through the legislature, would have to be approved by the public. But the proposal is to add a 7th member to Idaho's Commission for Reapportionment. And this is the commission that's responsible for redrawing legislative and congressional district boundaries every 10 years to update the population numbers. And right now it's a 6-member committee. It's evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. And 4 of them are needed to approve any new redistricting plan, so it requires some level of bipartisan agreement. Representative Stephen Harris of the Meridian wants to add a 7th member who would be elected by 5 of the state's constitutional officers, all of whom right now are Democrats, Republicans. So it would have, regardless of who's in office, it would have the effect of taking a commission that right now is evenly split and turning it into having a partisan balance one way or the other. And the bill was only introduced 2 days ago, and today we had the public hearing in House State Affairs. That was a huge point of contention both for Democrats, who started the meeting out by asking that the hearing be postponed till next week so that more people would have an opportunity to come and testify. A number of people who did testify, everybody who did testify was from Boise, and a number of those who testified in opposition said, I was going to the gym and I heard about this on the radio and I rushed down here to testify on it because it's so important to keep the nonpartisan nature of the commission. In fact, their comments, it was interesting to me, came before the public comments were even made. Representative Joe Palmer made a motion to send the bill to the House floor with a favorable recommendation. So he didn't even wait to hear from the public before deciding, yeah, this is a great idea, let's do it. Only one person testified in favor of the bill. That was Russ Hendricks from the Idaho Farm Bureau Federation. If you'll remember, the Farm Bureau Federation was the group that pushed the efforts to make it harder for initiatives to qualify for Idaho's ballot. Everybody else testified against it, arguing that, look, adding an element of partisanship to the reapportionment process doesn't work, and it not only doesn't work, but one of the best things about Idaho that we get ranked well for is the way we redistrict right now, and you're trying to mess with that. So.
We have a little more than a minute left, but I wanted to get your take, Dr. Witt. Is this going to prevent Idaho from being ensnared in lawsuits regarding its redistricting like we've seen in almost every redistricting in the past long time?
No.
All right, simple. But we have, even before we adopted this bipartisan 6-person panel, we saw lawsuits.
Well, there are lawsuits probably under every form of redistricting because you are deciding who wins and loses in electoral contests in some ways. So stacking the commission with a partisan majority may just engender even more lawsuits than we had under the bipartisan commission that we have now.
And we all covered the 2012 redistricting lawsuit, and it was so much fun. Fun all around. Betsy, I wanted to get your take. It looks like this has strong support in the House. Any idea what the voters might do?
This bipartisan process was created by the voters in 1993 in a constitutional amendment because they were just sick of the way that our state handled reapportionment. It was handled by the legislators themselves. It was extremely partisan. It was all about personal animus and who was getting who. And moving away from that, I don't think is going to be popular at all.
All right. Thanks so much, and thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.